Sounds True presents Music as Medicine, Session 11, Musical Color with Kay Gardner.
Next on our journey through the healing elements of music, we come to instrumental color. This merely means how each particular instrument sounds. And like the drone, which we discussed earlier, different instruments have the potential of touching us in different places on our bodies. So you can use the instruments either as a drone or in melody or harmony, but each individual instrument or family of instruments can touch us and resonate us in specific places. For example, a flute is very unlikely to resonate your abdomen. Why? Well, because the sound isn't penetrating enough, the sound isn't loud enough, and most important, the sound isn't deep enough to touch the massive organs that reside in the belly area. On the other hand, low-pitched, powerful instruments such as the tuba or the kettle drums are likely to touch the abdomen because of their lower, slower wavelengths of sound and the volume of sound that they can give us. Each instrument has its own specific quality of sound, and each instrument, because of that, will touch us in a different place. And remember, too, that the chakras, located in the etheric double outside the physical body, each have frequencies of vibration. The slower-moving chakric wheels are at the base. As we move up the body, each chakra has a higher rate of vibration. So in healing music, we have almost an unlimited choice of music instruments that we can listen to or compose with, and each one of those will have a different effect on the body, mind, and spirit. I surmise that whenever an organ or a gland or a wave pattern is duplicated by an instrument, it will be resonated and affected by that sound. So used in conjunction with visualization, instrumental sounds may be effective in stimulating areas of our bodies. For example, if you had a pain in your lower back, you might want to listen to a bassoon or a baritone saxophone, visualizing the energy of the instrument's sound going into that painful area, resonating it, and dispersing the stress or the tension. Our unseen bodies, those layers of vibration in our auras, because of their harmonic relationship to our physical bodies, will also be affected by particular instruments, because each instrument emphasizes a different set of harmonics in the way that its tone is created. Joachim Ernst Berendt, in his book The Third Ear, writes, "All of our culture's musical appliances derive from Pythagoras' monochord." Now, we have infinite instruments to choose from. In the West, we usually use the orchestral instruments, adding the plucked guitar and the banjo. But because communications are opening up all over the world, we are being introduced to different sounds from different cultures almost every day. And composers who are lucky enough to live near urban areas or to have access to these instruments are incorporating them. So all music that's being composed today is leaning toward and traveling toward a combination of all these different world instruments and has much more potential for variety of sound. It's a very exciting time to be in right now. Basically, though, we work with 4 families of instruments. And those 4 families are the string family, violins, guitars, harp, strings that are either bowed or plucked, the wind family, which means anything that's blown, the percussion instrument, which is anything that is hit or struck or shaken, and electronic instruments. String instruments, especially bowed string instruments, are extremely versatile. They are the instrument that sounds closest to the human voice, and so they can be used for pulling up emotions of all kinds. I don't have a string orchestra with me here today, but I do have the synthesizer. The scientists who invented the synthesizers were able to take out the particular set of harmonics that describes each instrument and duplicate them, not perfectly by any means, but closely enough for the synthesized sound to sound similar to that of the acoustic instrument. You'll notice that each instrument has a different timbre. I mean by timbre, quality of sound. Why does an oboe sound like an oboe? I've asked this question before in this series. Why does a flute sound like a flute, a clarinet like a clarinet, and so forth? Because each instrument emphasizes a different set of harmonics in its tone production, a different set of overtones. For example, as I said earlier, the oboe has all the frequencies, therefore it sounds very nasal. The clarinet only emphasizes the odd-numbered overtones, and that's why it has such a hollow, kind of throaty quality, whereas the flute only emphasizes octaves, and that's why it has such a pure sound, because there's no other harmonic in it. It's all sameness. So let's go through the different instruments briefly. The 12th century musician Hildegard of Bingen believed that the sound of bowed string instruments reflected the earthly soul struggling back to the light. She felt that in all music of lamentation, the string sound could draw repenting tears from even the most hard-hearted person. I orchestrate for strings a lot because there's so much they can do, individually and together. Not only can you draw the bow across the string to get a smooth sound, but you can pluck the string, you can actually turn the bow around and use the wood part of the bow to bounce on the string. There's many, many things you can do with a string. You can play harmonics. Remember when we looked at the monochord, how if you put your finger lightly at half the string, you will get these wonderful high plucked sounds, and those are harmonics. You can do that with string instruments. There's just a wonderful variety of sounds they can make. And each member of the string family has its own unique voice, starting with the highest one of all, and that's the violin. And then the viola, which is the alto violin. Perhaps while you're listening to these instruments, you might close your eyes and let them touch your body. Realize, where do I feel the sound of this instrument? Do I feel it in my chest? Do I feel it in my belly? Do I feel it in my head? And in this way, when you have dis-ease or distress in a certain part of the body, you'll know which instruments touch that part of the body, and you'll be able to choose intelligently when you're picking recorded music or creating music of your own, which instruments to use. So we'll move to the cello now. Double bass. Now these are all bowed string instruments. Did you notice where each one of these touched you? Did the double bass touch you in the head? Did the violin touch you in the most massive parts of the body? Did you notice a difference that the range of the instrument created and how it touched you? Some instruments only have a limited range of where they can touch you. Other instruments can touch the entire organism, such as the harp. Hildegard called the harp the instrument of heavenly blessedness. And the harp, because it has a full range from the very highest notes to the very lowest notes, can touch the entire organism. I think that's why so much New Age music and so much heavenly music tends to be on the harp. We think of angels when we hear the harp. Harps are rather accessible too, because you don't need a big concert harp with pedals to benefit. There are folk harps that fit right in the lap, Celtic harps that you can get. These smaller harps aren't going to touch us the way the big concert harp is, because they don't have the range. In Japan, there's an instrument called the koto, and the koto is a Japanese harp. And I'd like to bring some of the instruments from other cultures in here, because you'll be hearing more and more of them as we discover them. I find that the string orchestra touches the heart. And so when I created a Rainbow Path, which was an orchestral composition featuring a 5-minute segment for each of the chakras, I used the string orchestra, the timpani, or the kettle drums, and the harp as the main instruments in this movement, because it's my belief that the string orchestra, of all combinations of instruments, touches the heart the most. I think you noticed that the string orchestra was the body of the piece, accompanied by harp, with the harp glissando. The harp went sweeping upwards, and the strings played on very high harmonics, and the harp then went downwards, sweeping again. So this particular piece used all the instruments that touch the harp. Other plucked stringed instruments are the Indian sitar, the tambura, which we've already talked about, the veena, which is another plucked stringed instrument from India. In fact, the instrument that the goddess Saraswati is shown playing the most. The guitar, the banjo. An instrument that is kind of a combination of string and percussion is the piano, because it is a set of stretched strings, but they are being hammered. They are being struck. So the piano can go either way. It can be used as a string instrument or it could be used as a percussion instrument. And it, like the harp, has the full range of touching the entire human organism because of its range from low to very high. But because of its percussive nature, it doesn't quite have the effect of settling one down as the harp does with its plucked strings. Now we get into the wind family. That's the flute, the clarinet, the oboe, the bassoon, the saxophones, all of these blown instruments. Later we'll talk about other blown instruments, but they're made out of brass, so they fit into the brass family. The flute accompanies the mystical marriage of the soul with God, according to Hildegard of Bingen. And obviously you've heard the flute a lot because that's my major instrument. But just to remind you of the sound, here's a little flute sound. Next to the drum, the flute is the oldest of instruments. I love the story of the invention of the flute. This is the story my teacher told me. The god Pan in ancient Greece was half goat and half boy. He was goat on the bottom and boy on the top. And he fell in love with a certain nymph, a nymph named Syrinx. She lived down by the water. She was a water nymph. And he was chasing her one afternoon, trying to kiss her. And she ran down to the water and turned herself into a bunch of water reeds. And as he caught her was the very moment she transformed herself. And as he breathed a sigh of sadness or frustration, he noticed that the water reeds made a sound. And he bound them together, and that became the first flute, which was the panpipes. So flutes have always been a very important instrument in every culture, and they offer a sound that touches the head area the most. You'll feel a flute in the head rather than in the belly. If I were to say the word clarinet, where on your body would you point your finger as to where it touches you? Think about it for a second. Where do you feel the clarinet? Are you familiar with the sound? Let's hear the synthesized approximation of the clarinet sound. Where does that touch you? Where do you point immediately? Most folks point to the throat area, and it's really interesting to note that the range that I was playing of the clarinet is called the throat range. And I used this one for the throat chakra when I wrote Rainbow Path, giving it the solo. I also used in that movement the oboe, because the oboe also has the same range of sound, but as I've said before, it has a much more nasal sound. Because of its range, it is also an instrument that touches the throat area. Let's hear an example of the real oboe sound and the real clarinet sound in the piece for the throat chakra. I do want you to know, though, that in every movement in a Rainbow Path, the harp is featured. The harp is the continuing thread throughout the whole thing. So this piece features the clarinet and the oboe, the violin too, along with the harp, all in the range of the throat chakra. A deeper version of the oboe is the bassoon. And the bassoon is a wonderful instrument if you want to write comic pieces, but it also has a depth that can be used to touch the lower parts of the body. So I used the bassoon as the featured instrument or the solo instrument, the instrument with the melody, in the piece I wrote for the root chakra, the base of the spine. You'll notice that there are other instruments as well, but the bassoon is the featured instrument. Now, the set of saxophones, I don't use saxophones very often, and I don't know if it's a classical musician prejudiced against an instrument that is used in dance halls or got its start in dance halls or what. But saxophones are very loud, and as an orchestral musician, it's been very difficult to deal with them because they're louder than anything else. They have been used in classical music. Ravel used them in the Bolero to wonderful effect, but they're not used a whole lot in classical music. In New Age music, we're hearing saxophones a lot, but mostly the high ones, like the soprano saxophone. Paul Winter is a wonderful instrumentalist whose saxophone we hear. In jazz, we hear a deeper saxophone. Jerry Mulligan, Walt Desmond, some of the older saxophone players play really mellow music that can be used for healing. The dance hall, real loud, blaring music is wonderful to dance to, but it isn't particularly healing in its ability to settle us down. Because most of you are familiar with the sound of the saxophone, I'll pass and move on to the next family of instruments, the brass instruments. My favorite of the brass instruments is the French horn. Now, this instrument originated as an alpine horn, and it was hugely long. It was very, very long, and then somebody got the bright idea of kind of rolling it up in a spiral, and that became the French horn. And it has a wonderful quality of sound. It, like the oboe, and like the string family, like the violins, contains all of the harmonics in its tone production. So it can touch us very deeply. This penetrating sound, the sound that I showed you when we were working on toning, the sound that amplified the harmonics earlier, this same quality of sound exists in the French horn. And the French horn is the instrument that touches the belly and the solar plexus area the most. And so I used this in a rainbow path when I wrote the piece for the belly chakra. So the French horn is featured here. Along with the other instruments, you may have noticed that the trombone was in there as well, and it too, as a brass instrument, can touch us in the belly and in the solar plexus area. Other instruments in the brass family are the trumpet, the cornet, the flugelhorn. I don't use these very often. They're a little too bright in quality of sound for me, personally, but that isn't to say that it can't be used. The trumpet has a wonderfully heroic quality that you can use. Where I feel the trumpet, I feel it in the upper chest. It just expands the upper chest. So keep on feeling where these touch you, and you'll be aware of why certain composers use this wonderful array of instruments, because they can access so many different parts of the body and the spirit. And again, besides the French horn and the trombone, the tuba, the even deeper sound, can be used wonderfully to vibrate the lower chakra areas. I love what Peter Hamel says in his Through Music to the Self book. When rhythm inspires us, the magical consciousness awakes in us. And percussion instruments are the instruments that give us that rhythmic basis. They can add to the drama of a piece with huge emotional crescendos. They can set a regular throbbing pulse underneath the other instruments, like the heartbeat. Because of the great variety of percussion instruments, they're wonderful for special effects. We're most familiar with the drums, obviously, the native drum, which we have heard, and such drums as the snare drum. As I've mentioned before, the percussion instrument I use the most, and the one that always sets the heartbeat in all of my pieces, is the timpani, or the kettle drums. There are many sizes of timpani, from the largest ones who hit us with the deepest vibrations to small ones who go up much higher in the body. And we have that choice of a full array of those timpani sounds. The set of percussion instruments that are called vibrating plates are gongs and cymbals. Cymbals can create quite a noise, but they can also emphasize a dramatic point you want to make. As I mentioned earlier, I traveled to Bali with Don Campbell and a group of sound healers in 1988, and we were lucky enough to spend about 10 days studying gamelan, which is the Balinese orchestra, made up entirely of percussion instruments, from the largest gongs to the metallophones. In case you've never heard what a gamelan sounds like, I'll give a little example of some of the gamelan music I heard in Bali. Within gamelan are mallet instruments. What do I mean by mallet instruments? Instruments played with a mallet, like the xylophone, or the marimba, or the vibraphone, which is an instrument I use a lot. I think I mentioned earlier why I like the vibraphone, because one can set the movement of the discs within those resonating tubes to the brainwaves. And I'll play a little example of how I do that in a rainbow path. But first I want to show you the different timbres from the xylophone to the marimba to the vibraphone. The xylophone does not have resonating tubes underneath, so it has a more woody sound. The mallets are playing on wood. Add the resonating tubes, and you have a marimba. And then turn the bars that the mallets hit into metal and add the resonating tubes with the whirling discs, and you have the same basic instrument, but it's called the vibraphone. Here's a short example, and you heard it before, but I want you to hear it again, of the vibraphone as used to move us into the theta state. And this comes from the piece for the crown chakra in A Rainbow Path. So along with the flute, the wind chimes, a tubular bell, and angelic voices, the vibraphone was used for the crown chakra. Another percussion instrument that is used for healing in many cultures is the rattle. Many of you even have rattles. In the Caribbean, you would have maracas. You would have in Africa the shekere. Native Americans use rattles. The rattles contain many, many frequencies, and usually when shamans are doing their work or medicine people are doing their work, they will take the rattle and they will shake it right next to the ear of the person being treated. And that gets the person out of the busy chatter in their heads, because that frequency blocks out everything and prepares the person for the healing that's about to take place. I never thought of this, but I wonder why we give babies rattles. Maybe we give babies rattles for the same reason that we use them in healing, and that is to calm them down. I've already told you that I used the bassoon for the base chakra, and we had the French horn for the second chakra, and the strings for the heart, and the clarinet and oboe and violin for the throat, the vibraphone for the crown. I left out two. One of them, the solar plexus. This instrument, again, would be touched by French horn. It may be touched by trumpet. In Rainbow Path, I chose to use the viola, the alto violin, and the English horn, which is the alto oboe. For the third eye, even though it's a high chakra, there's a depth about the third eye. The third eye is the center of insight, you remember that, of deep meditation. And so I used the alto flute. And I used the vibraphone, but not set to theta as I did in the crown, set to alpha. So perhaps we can end this series on the musical instruments with a third eye meditation using the alto flute. In this meditation, we'll use the harmonium, which is a keyboard instrument, but a reed instrument as well, because a bellows controls the production of the sound. And you'll notice that the drone that it sets up has a pulsation to it, which we'll also use as the rhythm of the piece. I'll be playing the Saraswati Raga on my flute, and you just relax and get in touch with the third eye. Let whatever visions come to mind. Don't close your eyes if you're driving, but if you aren't driving, settle in and enjoy the meditation.